occurred to me that this, I would call it an immoral economy of microaggression, is a byproduct of institutionalized discrimination. But it also, we've moved from type C to type D, and the civil rights movement was supposed to end direct institutionalized discrimination. Jim Crow and legal segregation, de jure. This is de facto, right? But what's happening, as I understand it, is that the last 30 or 40 years of microaggressions are leading back to new forms of direct institutionalized. And I'm going to try to explain that in a moment. First of all, it's important to understand microaggression in this macro context, so that we're going to have an understanding of how interpersonal dynamics and then social structural institutional dynamics intersect and feed off each other. It's very important to understand that. And the classification of the forms of discrimination into these four types is something that's the result of a good 40 years of social science research. And I'm thinking really some very important contributors to that have been people like Joe Fagan, who's produced a really good set of books on institutionalized racial discrimination in the United States. And very briefly, and I'll give you concrete examples of type A. In fact, a lot of microaggressions are type A forms of discrimination. But again, they often occur, feed off, or justify the other levels of discrimination. But individual and isolate is the first type that folks like Joe Fagan talk about. And this doesn't mean that it's rare, that it's not isolated that way. It's isolated only in the sense that it occurs in interpersonal situations and interactions, and may not have the imprimatur or legitimacy or power of an institution or an organization behind it. A good example of this would be a white police person just having a pattern of harassing and using violence against black males or Native American males. I think our Seattle Police Department has a lot of those. Now, when it becomes a pattern and the institution begins to cover it up or protect those who engage in individual isolate acts of discrimination, then we're moving into small group forms. And so this is why it's important to see how these microaggressions can feed up the chain of structure. But it also works the other way, because if you have rules and organizational norms and community norms that have been institutionalized that create space for microaggression, then it's going the other way as well. So it's a very dialectical, complex process. And so where do you start? Do you deal with educating people to be culturally sensitive? We need to stop wasting time with that. And that's what they did to you from what you told me. Let's talk about it and get some meaning out of it. That only serves their aim, which is to delegitimize any radical proposals for structural change that allow these spaces to exist where microaggression can be perpetuated. Right? So we got to link the structural dimension always. Regardless of postmodernism, there is this thing called social structure, and we need to understand it as a power knowledge, part of the power knowledge dynamic that Foucault says. And I think Foucault would be the first to say, I'm not post-structuralist. Wouldn't you agree with that, Bonnie? He would argue, I think, that
he's not a post-structuralist?
Yeah. He never called himself one.
Foundational post-structuralist.
Well, I know, but actually it turns out that structure doesn't end just because we have discursive games of truth that try to obfuscate that fact. I mean, for example, you could be an extreme postmodernist like Baudrillard and claim that hunger is a simulation, but it's not. It's a biophysical condition caused by structural violence, right? So,
they weren't arguing that there's no structure, that just that they change and that they're socially created and historically situated.
Correct. Well, it depends on whether we're talking about affirmative or skeptical postmodernists.
Okay,
well, let's not get into that. That's for another. That would be an interesting conversation to have, but not today. Now, a small group is where a group of individuals in the dominant demographic, if you will, the dominant social class, race, location, will engage in activities that target entire groups of an unwanted other. And a very good example of that would be the KKK burning down black churches during the 1940s and 50s, or white men leading raids on African American communities to conduct lynchings. So that's.
How about eugenics?
that already gets more into a direct institutionalized form of discrimination. And it's making a comeback too, and that's why I'm saying it's really important to say, you know, a lot of people assume with 1964 Civil Rights Act, we ended de jure discrimination, and I suppose technically we did, but it's rearing its ugly form again. It's being reinvented, and we're getting back from Type B, which succeeded the direct forms after the Civil Rights Movement created these legislative changes. But now my theory is that the accumulation of microaggressions rationalizes and justifies new forms of direct institutionalized discrimination. And it's a good way of illustrating that, I think, would be, because I don't want to take too long, I want to leave time for Karen too, would be that...
We got till 10 o'clock.
Well, you said you had 2 slides, we've
8:30.
only seen
No,
one.
hold on. I will get back to that.
You guys trying to rush out of here?
Also left field
They've
from
noticed
this
at 10
discussion,
o'clock.
please take as much time as you want.
Well,
I would have some discussion.
a good example of direct institutionalized forms of discrimination is, of course, Jim Crow laws, legal segregation. It's de jure. But what I think is interesting about this is that it represents, if we invoke Agamben, a state of exception, where you're suspending the rule of law for particular types of individuals, denying them due process equal protection. And this state of exception is something that is at the core of direct institutionalized discrimination. Okay? Now, with the rise of the Civil Rights Movement, it became impossible for us to say, if I was a president of the university and I was in charge of the admissions system, under direct institutionalized, we would have rules that say, this is a white-only campus. There's no changing that. That becomes illegal. How am I going to keep it a mainly whites-only campus? And the way I do it is that I fiddle around with all of the technologies of governmentality, if you will, including how we measure people's admissibility through scores. But we all know, well, if those scores are based on culturally biased testing, then GREs or SATs or ACTs aren't really measuring anything substantive. It's measuring an imaginary, culturally preferred form of intelligence. And that's all it's measuring. And this has been proven, I mean, we've known this for 30, 40 years. One of the great victories, I think, of the movement for diversity in academia was when a lot of departments decided that they would no longer use the GRE as a primary marker for determining admissibility of a candidate. And a softer quantification showed up, which is use the GPA of the last 2 years of the undergraduate course of study. So for graduate school admissions, we've been weaning ourselves slowly away from GREs toward something that presumably might be less culturally biased, but only if that student has gone to a school that has a really effective multicultural curriculum. And the number of students that are exposed to that kind of curriculum is probably less than 2%. So that's not very viable either. But it does suggest that when people have, that GPA is a good predictor of academic success, is generally held true. And as a result of that, it's changed, it's allowed us to get beyond the direct institutionalized form of discrimination that depended on culturally biased exam scores to determine admissions. I would like to point out that with indirect institutionalized discrimination, a lot of this happens through the championing of new forms of diversity. New forms of diversity come into being. And the most common form that I've been struggling with at this university is epistemological diversity. That, we have a Chicano, and I'm supposed to represent the epistemological diversity of all Chicanos everywhere for all time. So it's done. We've taken care of that. What we need now is people who will do genetics and anthropology, and this will bring epistemological diversity to the department, right? And so right now, in fact, we're getting ready to hire someone that does genetics and anthropology. Speaking of eugenics, it'll be interesting to see who we bring in. So this becomes a new way to get away from the unaddressed, unresolved claims of the historically underrepresented groups. Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos, Chicanos, and other Latino Americans. Those are the historically underrepresented groups, including Asian Pacific Islanders and Alaska Natives. And So the new forms of diversity are epistemological and internationalization and globalization of the faculty. So those have become like the new tools to continue indirect institutionalized discrimination without ever saying, oh no, we're not against diversity. In fact, they're turning it on its head, saying, we're totally for diversity. It's just that you no longer represent the kind of diversity that we've determined is legitimate from the point of view of academic and scholarly concerns. And this is one of the most dangerous problems we face now, because it's very difficult to sort of pin that down to a set of policies that gives you a smoking gun on the basis of, say, race, ethnicity, social class, or some other category of difference that's also equally socially structured, but one that then gets occluded by internationalization, globalization, and epistemological diversity. And yet...
Have you written on this?
No.
I really want to see something. I like this.
It's a read.
Let's work on one.
Can
It's
you,
a
I've been
yeah.
wanting to work with you all anyway, didn't
Can
Karina
you,
tell you?
who's talking about this besides you?
Me.
I haven't
This
read
is
it.
good
Dan,
stuff.
you know-
Actually, in women's studies right now, there's some discussion.
Well, yeah, in women's studies there is. That's
Because
true.
internationalization, globalization has had such an impact in the field, I would be glad to collaborate as a threesome.
Yeah.
I think it's a potent time now at
It's huge.
UW because this
So-
tool has been used.
There he is.
When, yeah,
This tool has been used so much.
I'm sure if somebody wanted to be in
it's
here.
bludgeoning us. It's being used to
Yeah.
silence and marginalize the historically underrepresented groups from making claims for redress of diversity.
Yeah, but, you know, talking about globalization, it's like, you know, people don't realize, you know, like they say the dominant and it's majority. It is not majority.
No,
It's like 1% of our you know, I'm sorry to say, and I got, this really burns me up, because my great uncle was a Carnegie. And he used to have John D. Rockefeller over to his house for dinner. And I've come to learn to hate these people. I mean, sitting there listening to them, put Scoop Jackson through school. And, you know, and all the things that got named for him. And making me mow his grass when I was a young kid, you know? And it's like, these, yeah, well.
that's what you're saying, and I completely agree. It is a minority. And when they refer to people as minorities or to the third world, we're talking about 2/3 of the world. A social majority, as Esteva Prakash phrased it in the book Grassroots Postmodernism. The 2/3 is a social majority. The 2/3 of the world is a social majority. So we're really actually talking about social majorities. Now, in the US context, to do that, we do have to negotiate two things. One is class, and the intersections of race and class and gender. Now, how does intersectional theory help us deal with these issues of epistemological violence that we're facing in the new wave of indirect and soon to become direct institutionalized forms of discrimination? And I think one of the things we need to do is, we need to argue for affirmative action policies that, and let's face it, in 1998 is when Initiative 200 was adopted by Washington state voters, ending affirmative action in the state of Washington, correct? It was 98. Now, however, who would object if we did affirmative action on the basis of social class, of low income? And if you did that, what's the best predictor for low income in this society? Race and ethnic status is the most robust predictor of whether you're going to be low income or not. But it would allow us a way, in a way, playing a discourse game of truth with these perpetrators of the new forms of epistemological diversity that they may not be able to delegitimize.
Well, except for the erosion of the middle class, which is still ballooning the lower end.
More and more.
Well, from the latest I've seen, that's being exaggerated. Although the middle class is predominantly white, 80% of the people who have lost their homes due to foreclosure are people of color. So even there, I mean, yeah, poverty's increasing. They're newly poor white middle class people. Yes, that is true. And in my opinion, they should also be beneficiaries of affirmative action, of access to the universities. I think that would benefit everyone. It would lead to less polarization and prospects for greater solidarity to occur.
But, you know,
Yeah, lines of politics, as you said earlier.
but, you know, you're saying, I mean, look at the debt slaves they're making out of us with student loans. I mean, they're chaining us down into being on the treadmill right off the bat. I mean, I think I'm at 40 grand, you know, and I got two years of scholarship, so I'm sure it'd be even